take a look at the first years here. Just to mention some types of writing, we have the chronicles of European explorers, and we've seen this with Champlain, we've seen this with Cabeza de Vaca, we've seen this with Columbus. These are called chronicles because they chronologically explain what's being seen in a sequence of events, a lot of the times as diaries, a lot of the times as observations, but that chronos for chronicles is an important thing because it's supposed to be observation, writing down, this is what I see. Even though it's interpreted by the person that's writing, that has a big effect on what's produced. We've got the captivity narrative, so now we've got a narrative, which is a recount, which could be true, could be untrue. I mean, there's many cases where we're going to see where there are people that are captured and they write about it afterwards, but this sort of captivity narrative in the beginning is usually true, but as they're rewritten and rewritten, during the Romantic period in the 1820s and 30s, the captivity narrative once again is something that's picked up in different countries. Spiritual autobiographies, this is an interesting section. At the beginning I told you that we would not have too many autobiographies, but this a spiritual autobiography at the beginning is important because it does have a certain pattern that's followed, and we're going to look at what that pattern is later on. But it's a person that basically says, I've sinned. This is, then they find their way out of sin, they find God, and at the end they show that, they become a good Christian. So this is an example of a spiritual autobiography, and we're going to see that. We also have poetry and drama. These are works that are approaching the novel as a genre. So the novel itself, people will tell you this is true or not true, but some people mark Cervantes' Don Quixote as the first novel written. That was 1605 was the first book, and 1615 was the second book. So, when that was written in Spain, that type of genre makes its way across the ocean eventually, and people will be writing later on novels, as we'll see. So let's take a look at a little bit of historical background. We've got the Pilgrims and the Puritans. These are two terms that are often confused. Here's some basic information on them. Some information that, it's good to separate one from the other because they do, in the base of their ideas, there are some differences in them. Here's a replica of the Mayflower. Most people, when you think about boats and stuff and, what are the first boats? I think, at least I remember the Columbus's boats were the Nina the Pinta and the Santa Maria. I remembered those even before I started studying languages, but this is very interesting, the Mayflower, 1620. And a lot of people can trace their roots back to the Mayflower. In Boston, you've got the Blue Blood clubs and all that, people that can trace their roots all the way back to the Mayflower. And it's just people with a deep genealogy back into Europe. I know a lot of people that have this connection to the Mayflower, and it's very good to be considered for many people like a true Bostonian in that sense. But anyways, let's move on. So the Pilgrims, in the 16th century, just to give you a little bit of background on it, Henry VIII of England split from the Roman Catholic Church and created the Church of England. Now, if you think about this, it's kind of in the southern, this would take a really long time to explain it, but at least in Europe at this point, you could see that the southern part of Europe is going to be very Catholic, and the north of Europe is going to be very Protestant. And this actually travels around the world at some point, because you could see over in the United States, we've got the Protestantism in the United States today, and a lot of the Catholicism still in the South, Central America and South America, even though there is a lot of spiritual revivalism of Protestant movements in the world. And same thing in Asia. A lot of the North is Protestant, newer Protestantism. And in the Philippines, is actually, I think it's 98% Roman Catholic. So this is kind of an interesting historical global thing. So, so the Puritans in England went over to the New World, kind of laterally. And the separatists, in this sense, let's get back to what we're talking about. The separatists didn't believe the king should head the church and broke off. So the separatists would be here, the Pilgrims. And they thought anyone could worship God and read the Bible in their own way. They didn't want to be scripted exactly about what needed to be done, how it needed to be done, and how they needed to believe. So they wanted this freedom. They wanted this space. So where do they find the space? Let's go somewhere else. Let's go to the New World. So William Bradford led the Pilgrims toward Virginia. They wanted to go, I believe, down to Jamestown, but they ended up in Massachusetts Bay and landed in Plymouth in 1620. Came over in the Mayflower, like I mentioned. So Plymouth Plantation is a place where you can go and visit. And it still today is a place that's set up. I'll show you a picture of that in a few minutes. So the first winter was difficult, but the Wampanoag Indians helped them. And this is the most celebrated holiday in the United States, I believe, Thanksgiving. But it traces back to how Messiswat, the leader, helped them through the first winter and aided by Squanto helped the Pilgrims survive. And this is the origin of the first Thanksgiving. So this is Plymouth Plantation. You could see, and you can still visit it today. And it's very reconstruction of a lot of the houses and trying to make it look the way it should have looked back in the days when they first arrived. So the Puritans didn't want to separate entirely from the Church of England. So you've got this bifurcation there. There's a little fork there where they're just, the Pilgrims are going to believe this, and the Puritans are going to have a different way. But they did want reforms. So John Winthrop led some 1,000 people to the New World and set the Massachusetts Bay Colony up, which was the start of the Great Migration. So they followed strict adherence to the laws of God, and based on their colonial government, it was based on these laws. So, when we think about the Pilgrims, when in the United States, when you're in elementary school and you dress up, let's dress up as the Pilgrims. People think Pilgrims, first people to arrive, and they dress up in special outfits because it's all connected to Thanksgiving. But when you think about the literature and the connections between the the heritage, the literary heritage we have today really comes from the Puritan strain of that. And we're going to take a great look at that and see what that influence was. Because that went all the way through and even influenced, like I mentioned, Nathaniel Hawthorne's writing in the 1800s when he wrote about, like, for example, the Scarlet Letter. Important to look at those things. So this was influenced by the iconoclastic Swiss theologian John Calvin, Calvinism, and Puritanism. This connection here is important. So you might, want to do a little bit of research on John Calvin to connect that with that. Let's see here. So we have got John Smith. So he was an English explorer. He was the leader of the Virginia colony, which was the first permanent English settlement in North America. Now, we're stepping back here a bit because obviously, the section 1620 and on, but when we think about the writing, the stuff that he wrote was after that, so I'm putting this in here now. He traveled up north and named New England, this part, where I live and where the Puritans were. And you can see the influence that he's had on the arrival. So here's a statue of him, very important, but connect him once again with, he's British. He came over with this in mind, but it's a very curious lifestyle. He was put up as an apprenticeship, but then his father died, and when his father died, he was able to start traveling because he didn't have to continue his apprenticeship. So he had enlisted in a couple of different armies, connected, fighting against the Spanish at one point, and then he joined another regiment, and he was captured by the Turks. And actually, he got away by, if I recall correctly, by killing his master and fleeing back to England in 1605. But anyways, when he arrived back in England, he promoted migration to the New World. He wrote a number of books, of which his most famous is The General History of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles in 1624. So you could take a look at this book, which was written to get people to go over, because keep in mind that, Christopher Columbus and a lot of the other explorers, they weren't just going to explore, they were actually, it was all for financial reasons. So, he had some investors that gave him some money, and he brought some people over, and, all of this is all about making money. Settling in new places, yes, to have religious freedom, but there's always commercial interest in that in mind. So part of this, people believe that a lot of these were used as propaganda. Well, not really propaganda, but they were used so people would be interested in, and they could learn about the general history of Virginia and New England. So they would become curious and maybe want to go over and live there themselves. So he's probably most well known, however, for his own story about he was taken captive by the Chesapeake Bay Indians and then freed by the chief's daughter, Pocahontas. This is a story that has been told again and again. You can see here Pocahontas is, no, don't kill him. And she saves him. And this whole relationship is, somewhat true, somewhat, there's cast some doubt of the veracity of the whole thing, certain critics. But when, the story's been retold many times, perhaps most famously by the 2 Disney movies in her name. And like I said, some scholars question the veracity of it, but, this is something that he wrote himself, and, he's trying to back it up with some facts, but people did exist, and apparently that event took place. So, the events that you see today in the Disney movies obviously are a romanization of what actually happened, but this is just some of the historical background on part of our culture here in the United States.